let's see what Rit did. The very next day, Rit packed some small things into a tiny bag. He grabbed several pairs of his favorite striped socks and his hat, of course, gathered some crackers and a hunk of cheese for his adventure, left the path he had always taken, and journeyed to find a giant. As Rit traveled, he made up a song, and as he walked, he sang and whistled the tune. I would like to be with you, and you could be with me, and we will go on to the moon and see what we can see. When my life gets too hard to do, will you come set me free? And as you find a way to break through, will you turn around and rescue me? Because the way is not found alone, and the only way can be one is by getting to somewhere that you never known and do something you've never done. The path wasn't easy for Rit. There were rivers to cross. Rit loved playing in streams, so this wasn't terrible for him. He had forests to trek and long open spaces to cross where the sun beat down on him continuously. The heat at times was unbearable. But after a long journey, every journey being long for a small, Rit arrived at the place where the giants lived. They seemed so magnificent. He sat quietly for a moment and watched. Small, fearful thoughts began to fill his head. Will they step on me? Are they going to eat me? He wondered. Who am I to ask these giant questions? Mustering up a small amount of courage and trusting that he was making the right choice, Rit shook off these fearful thoughts and moved on. Rit approached a giant. His whole body shivered as he looked up. The giant's head was well above the clouds. His clothes were larger than life, similar to Rit's, but substantially bigger. The giant's brown vest and white shirt were all that was visible through the clouds. A giant green hanky hung from the giant's back pocket. It looked like an enormous flag blowing in the wind. Rit approached the massive being and began to climb. He hung on and climbed and climbed and climbed. As he reached the giant's shoulder, Rit could no longer see the ground below. His head spun, his knees wobbled. He held onto the giant's shirt collar to keep from falling. He had never been so far above the ground and was hanging on for dear life. Gathering as much courage as he could, Rit climbed up to the giant's ear and yelled, "Mr. Giant!" There was no answer. Rit tried again. "Mr. Giant!" The giant looked around and said, "Who was that? Who said that?" Rit yelled in his ear again, "Mr. Giant!" The giant roared again, "Who is that?" Rit covered his tiny ears. The giant's voice shook his entire body. He could hardly understand what the giant was saying because the sound was so immense. "Mr. Giant," yelled Rit, "I'm a small." The giant said, "A small here?" His voice vibrating and shaking. "Rit, what are you doing here?" "I came to ask you how you became a giant." The giant, moved by the courage of this tiny being, invited Rit onto his hand. "What a brave thing to do," said the giant. Rit sat against a fold in the giant's hand and looked up into his enormous eyes. The giant cleared his throat, a little choked up by Rit's bravery, and began to speak in a quieter tone. "I'm impressed by your bravery. I haven't seen a small in a very long time. I would be honored to share my story with you." Rit leaned forward as the giant continued. "My parents were giants, and they knew that the path to become a giant. They loved to explore the possibilities in the world around them. They dreamed impossible dreams and always thought of others and how they could best serve them. My parents' hearts were enormous. They were constantly looking for ways to improve themselves, serve others, and make their world a better place. Their giant feet took them down paths of endless possibility, and that helped them to reach their stature." Rit gasped and leaned in even closer. "My friend, I need you to know that I was born a small just like you." "At first," said the giant, "I didn't think I could measure up to my parents' stature. Even though they taught me their ways from childhood, it took me years before I finally believed. When I finally started doing what they told me all along, you know what happened?" Rit looked the giant straight in the eyes and asked, "What?" "Well, I began to grow." "What do you mean?" asked Rit. The giant said, "You see, giants think extraordinary thoughts, speak significant words, and see and do remarkable things. As I began to learn, my hearing improved and my vision expanded. That's what is magical about this world. By listening to my parents and doing what they did, I started to grow." Rit's thoughts were racing. Could this be true? This was madness. The small became a giant merely by thinking differently and making new choices. That's the difference between the giants and the smalls. Did that mean he could become a giant? There's only one way to find out, Rit thought to himself. Will you teach me how to become a giant? Rit asked. Wow, said the giant. This is a big thing you're asking me. I don't know if you're up for the changes that will come if you go down this path. You're asking me to help you grow in a way you don't fully understand. How can I know that you will do what it takes to grow? Rit got on his knees, hands clasped with a single tear streaming down his cheek. He said, Mr. Giant, I came here to learn about giants. I come from a long line of smalls, and I'm tired of living such an insignificant life. I believe I am capable of more. I want to prove to myself and the other smalls that anyone can become a giant. Will you please teach me? This small had come all this way and risked his life to learn something new. The giant's eyes watered. He closed his eyes for a moment, brought his hand close to his face, looked intently into Rit's eyes and said, okay, I'll teach you what I do, but becoming a giant is up to you. Rit jumped up and down on the giant's hand, nearly falling off in his excitement. Here he was, a small, being taught by a giant. He would be able to prove that he was capable of more. In his exuberance caused the giant to smile. He looked the giant right in his enormous eyes and said, my name is McBronze Rittenshanks, but you can call me Rit. The giant said, I, my new friend, am Rimmerus Eckeritz, and you can call me Remy. So as we pause here for a second and think of the message of this section, is Rit ventured out. He went out into the unknown. And often in our lives, we have a chance to step out into the unknown and not know how it's going to turn out. And even though we're afraid, we have a chance to show courage by climbing our giant, by finding somebody that maybe can mentor us, or by doing something that we normally wouldn't do. And so Rit was so committed to learning how to become a giant that he went to the land of the giants and he climbed a giant and he asked him if he would teach him. And the giant said yes. And he said, I'll teach you what I do, but becoming a giant is up to you. And